echoes of terror.
The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a place to escape the noise of the city, to reconnect with nature, and to spend a long weekend with friends. That's what the listing had promised anyway. But as Sarah pulled her car up the narrow, winding dirt road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was smaller than she'd expected, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging in the middle. The windows were dark, reflecting the overcast sky, and the surrounding forest was dense and shadowy, the trees so tall they seemed to block out the sun. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. "This is it?" Kyle asked from the passenger seat, his voice tinged with disbelief. He was Sarah's boyfriend of 3 years, the kind of guy who always looked on the bright side, but even he sounded skeptical. "It's rustic," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "It'll be fun. You'll see." In the back seat, Emma and Ben exchanged a look. Emma was Sarah's best friend, practical and no nonsense, while Ben was Kyle's college buddy, the kind of guy who thought everything was a joke. They'd all been looking forward to this trip, but now, as they stepped out of the car and into the cool, damp air, the excitement felt forced. "Rustic is one word for it," Ben said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Creepy is another." "It's not creepy," Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. "It's just secluded." "Yeah, secluded," Kyle said, glancing at the trees. "Like, no one will hear you scream. Secluded." Emma rolled her eyes. "You're such a baby, it's fine. Let's just get inside and unpack." Sarah had always been the planner of the group. She was the one who organized the trips, who made the reservations, who kept everyone on track. It was a role she'd taken on willingly, but lately, it had started to feel like a burden. Work had been overwhelming, and her relationship with Kyle had been strained. They hadn't fought, not exactly, but there was a distance between them that hadn't been there before. She'd hoped this trip would fix that, would bring them all closer together. But now, standing in front of the cabin, she wasn't so sure. Kyle was the opposite of Sarah in almost every way. He was spontaneous, adventurous, always looking for the next thrill. He'd been the one to suggest the camping trip, and Sarah had agreed, partly because she wanted to make him happy and partly because she needed a break. But as much as she loved him, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were drifting apart. She didn't know how to fix it, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Emma was Sarah's rock. They'd been friends since college, and Emma had always been the voice of reason, the one who kept Sarah grounded. She was practical, level-headed, and fiercely loyal, but she was also guarded, the kind of person who didn't let many people in. Sarah had always respected that about her, but sometimes she wondered if there was more to Emma than she let on. Ben was the wild card. He joined their group through Kyle, and while he wasn't as close to Sarah as Emma was, he'd become an integral part of their dynamic. He was the joker, the one who could make anyone laugh, even in the worst situations. But he was also the most unpredictable, the one who always seemed to be hiding something. Sarah had never been able to figure him out, and that made her uneasy. The inside of the cabin was just as underwhelming as the outside. The furniture was old and worn, the walls bare except for a few faded photographs of the forest. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. Sarah tried to ignore it, focusing instead on unpacking and getting settled. They spent the afternoon exploring the area, hiking through the woods and trying to make the best of it. But the forest felt wrong. The trees were too close together, their branches twisted and gnarled, like they were reaching for something. The ground was soft and spongy, the air thick and heavy, and the silent sight was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. By the time they got back to the cabin, the sun was setting and the shadows were long and deep. They built a fire in the fireplace, the warmth a welcome relief from the chill that seemed to seep into everything. But even as they sat around the fire, laughing and joking, the unease lingered just beneath the surface. On the first night, Sarah was the first to hear it. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard the sound. A low, guttural growl coming from outside the cabin. She sat up, her heart pounding, and listened. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the window. "Kyle," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Kyle groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "That sound. Outside." Kyle listened for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't hear anything. Go back to sleep." Sarah lay back down, but she didn't sleep. The growl was still there, faint but unmistakable, and it stayed with her until the sun came up. The next morning, Sarah didn't mention the growl. She told herself it was just her imagination, just the stress of the trip. But as they sat around the table, eating breakfast, she noticed something strange. The photographs on the wall, the ones of the forest, were different. The trees in the photos were twisted and gnarled, just like the ones outside, but there was something else. In each photo, hidden among the trees, was a figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. "Did these photos always look like this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Kyle glanced at the photos and shrugged. "I don't know. I didn't really look at them." Emma and Ben didn't say anything, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. They'd noticed it too. The day started normally enough. They decided to hike to a nearby lake, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over them like a fog. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the trees pressing in on either side. The silence was back, heavier than before, and the air felt colder, even though the sun was shining. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced they were being followed, but there was never anything there. When they reached the lake, it was nothing like Sarah had imagined. The water was dark and still, the surface like glass. The trees around it were twisted and gnarled, their roots snaking into the water like they were drinking from it. The whole place felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. "This is creepy as hell," Ben muttered, voicing what they were all thinking. Emma walked to the edge of the water, her arms wrapped around herself. "It's so quiet, like unnaturally quiet." Sarah joined her, staring at the water. It was so still, so dark, like it went down forever. She had the sudden irrational thought that something was down there, watching them. She shook it off, but the feeling didn't go away. "Let's just eat lunch and head back," Kyle said, his voice tight. He was standing a few feet away from the water, his arms crossed, like he didn't want to get too close. They sat on a fallen log, passing around sandwiches and water bottles. No one talked much. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. Sarah kept glancing at the water, half expecting to see something break the surface, but it remained still, like a mirror reflecting the twisted trees. And then they heard it. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. A scream, high and piercing, coming from the woods. Sarah shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "What the hell was that?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. "It sounded like a person," Emma said, her eyes wide with fear. Kyle was already on his feet, his bag slung over his shoulder. "We need to go. Now. We can't just leave," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. What if someone's hurt? What if it's not someone? Kyle shot back, his voice sharp. What if it's the thing that was growling last night? Sarah hesitated. She wanted to argue, to say they had to help, but the scream had chilled her to the bone. It didn't sound human. Not entirely. Before she could decide, the scream came again, closer this time. And then they saw it, a figure, moving through the trees. It was too far away to make out details, but it was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting to the side, like it was watching them. "Run," Kyle said, his voice low and urgent. They didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their bags and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise. The figure didn't follow, but Sarah could feel its eyes on them, burning into her back. By the time they made it back to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the forest was bathed in an eerie orange light. They were all breathing hard, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces pale with fear. "We need to leave," Kyle said again, his voice firm. "Now, before it gets dark." "We can't hike out in the dark," Sarah argued, though her heart wasn't in it. "It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous to stay here," Kyle shot back. "You saw that thing. You heard it. We're not safe here." "Kyle is right," Emma said quietly. Her hands were shaking, and she looked like she was on the verge of tears. "I don't want to stay here another night." Sarah looked at Ben, hoping for support, but Ben just shrugged. "I'm with them, man. This place is messed up." Sarah felt the weight of their fear pressing down on her. She wanted to argue, to say they were overreacting, but she couldn't. She'd seen the figure, she'd heard the scream, and she didn't want to stay here either. "Fine," she said finally. "We'll leave at first light." Kyle shook his head. "That's not good enough. We need to go now." "We can't," Sarah snapped, her frustration boiling over. "It's too risky. We'll get lost, or hurt, or worse. We'll wait until morning." Kyle stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but she pushed it down. She was doing the right thing. She had to be. They decided to take turns keeping watch, though no one thought they'd actually sleep. Sarah volunteered to go first, sitting by the fire with a flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. The others retreated to the cabin, though she could hear them whispering, their voices tense and anxious. The forest was quiet again, but it felt different now. The silence was heavy, oppressive, like it was waiting for something. Sarah kept glancing at the trees, her heart racing every time she thought she saw movement, but there was nothing. Just shadows. And then, just as she was starting to relax, she heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees. Sarah froze, her grip tightening on the knife. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the cabin. She could see it now. A dark shape moving through the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. "Guys," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's back." The growl was closer now, so close Sarah could feel it vibrating in her chest. The dark shape moved just beyond the firelight, its glowing eyes fixed on her. She gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white, and called out again, louder this time. "Guys, it's here." The cabin door burst open, and Kyle, Emma, and Ben stumbled out, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Kyle had a hatchet, Emma held a flashlight, and Ben clutched a heavy branch like a club. They formed a tight circle around the fire, their backs to each other, their eyes scanning the trees. "Where is it?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "There," Sarah said, pointing to the edge of the clearing. The shape was still there, its eyes glowing like embers. It didn't move, didn't attack. It just watched them, its head tilted to the side like it was studying them. "What the hell is that?" Ben asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but we need to get out of here. Now." Kyle nodded, his grip tightening on the hatchet. "We'll head back to the car. Stick together. Don't stop for anything." They moved as a unit, their steps slow and deliberate, their eyes never leaving the figure. It didn't follow them, but Sarah could feel its gaze burning into her back. The forest was silent again. The only sound, the crunch of leaves under their feet and the ragged sound of their breathing. They made it about halfway to the car before the forest came alive. It started with a whisper, faint and distant, like the wind through the trees. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. The whisper grew louder, closer, until it was all around them. A chorus of voices speaking in a language Sarah didn't understand. "What is that?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. "Keep moving," Kyle said, his voice tight. "Don't listen to it." But it was impossible not to listen. The whispers were inside Sarah's head now, echoing in her skull, filling her with a sense of dread so profound it made her knees weak. She wanted to stop, to cover her ears, to scream, but she forced herself to keep walking. And then the trees started moving. At first, Sarah thought it was her imagination, a trick of the shadows. But then she saw it, a branch reaching out, gnarled and twisted, like a hand. It brushed against her arm, and she jerked away, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching, their roots snaking across the ground. "Run!" Kyle shouted, and they did. They crashed through the underbrush, their flashlights bouncing wildly, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest was alive now, the trees twisting and groaning, the whispers a deafening roar. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran, her legs burning, her chest heaving, and then she heard it. A scream, high and piercing, coming from behind her. She turned, her heart in her throat, and saw Emma on the ground, her leg caught in a tangle of roots. The roots were moving, pulling her deeper into the forest. "Emma!" Sarah shouted, skidding to a stop. She grabbed her hand, pulling with all her strength, but the roots were too strong. Kyle and Ben were there in an instant, hacking at the roots with the hatchet and the branch. But for every root they cut, two more took its place. "Go!" Emma screamed, her voice raw with fear. "Just go!" "We're not leaving you," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. She kept pulling, kept fighting, but it was no use. The roots were dragging her away into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The roots went still, the whispers faded, and the forest was silent again. Emma lay on the ground, her leg free, her face pale and tear-streaked. What just happened?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Sarah said, helping Emma to her feet. "But we need to get out of here. Now." They ran the rest of the way to the car, their legs burning, their lungs screaming. The forest seemed to let them go, the trees parting to reveal the road. Sarah didn't stop to question it. She just ran, her hand gripping Emma's like a lifeline. When they finally reached the car, they piled in, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the car into gear, peeling out onto the road. No one spoke as they drove, the silence heavy and oppressive. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the forest chasing them, but there was nothing. Just the empty road, stretching out behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, a small, sleepy place with a gas station and a diner. Sarah pulled into the parking lot, her hands still shaking on the wheel. They sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, the silence stretching. What the hell was that? Ben asked finally, his voice breaking the silence. I don't know, Sarah said. But it's over. We're safe now. Emma nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Kyle was silent, his face pale, his eyes distant. Sarah didn't know what to say to him. She didn't know what to say to any of them. They went into the diner, the fluorescent lights harsh after the darkness of the forest. They ordered coffee and sat in a booth, their hands wrapped around the warm mugs, their eyes avoiding each other. And then Emma spoke. Sarah, she said, her voice trembling. Your arm. Sarah looked down and froze. Her sleeve was rolled up, and on her forearm, just above her wrist, was a mark. A jagged black line, like a scar. She hadn't noticed it before, but now that she saw it, she could feel it. A cold, pulsing ache deep in her bones. What is that? Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. She just stared at the mark, her mind racing. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the mark. You're mine now. The forest is still there, silent and waiting. If you drive past it, you might see a flicker of movement in the trees, a pair of glowing eyes watching you from the shadows. And if you're foolish enough to stop to step into the woods, you might hear the whispers. But be careful. The forest is always hungry, and once it marks you, there's no escape.